Hi, welcome to Front Porch Conversations here at Advent Christian Village. Thanks for tuning in to watch today. I'd like to introduce, if you don't know, our guest today is Tib Henderson. Tib, thank you for being here with us.
I'm glad to be here.
Well, I think we're going to have a good time, so we're on the front porch, use our little imaginations a little bit and have a visit.
Okay.
Good. Well, would you tell our members a little bit about your early life? Where were you born and lived?
Okay. I was born in Toledo, Ohio, but I was only there for 6 weeks, so I don't consider myself an Ohio person, really. I was moved to Stafford Springs, Connecticut, which is way up in the northeastern part of the state. And my family was involved in a woolen mill, which was very common in New England at that time. And it was a wonderful place to grow up. Small town America.
And you lived there most of your young years?
I was there until my junior year in high school. And at that point, my parents had been divorced, and my mother was married to an Air Force guy, and they were in the Panama Canal Zone. And I spent a year at school in the Panama Canal Zone.
Well, that was a big difference for northern Connecticut, wasn't it?
Quite a difference, yeah.
What are some of your favorite childhood memories in Connecticut?
It was just, looking back at it, it was a lovely time to be in a small town in America. It was during the Second World War, and the whole town was involved in that. We had family members who were off in the war zones fighting. We also had many women were working in the mills because the men were gone. Of course, we didn't think it was, we were just kids. We were just still being kids. Mm-hmm. But there was a feeling of the whole country being together and that we were part of it. I remember collecting milkweed pods when they opened up in the fall because they used the milkweed to stuff life jackets.
Oh, my goodness.
It felt as if you were really doing something important.
Do you remember hearing that World War II started?
Mm-hmm. I was at my grandparents' house. We were all having dinner. It was Sunday, and the radio was on, and we all heard about Pearl Harbor, and I was 5 years old, and it was very scary. Mm-hmm. And every night, my family listened to the radio news before supper, and it was very scary. I thought Hitler was going to climb right up over the hill and come right to our house.
And I've talked to a number of people who, it was hard. But like you said, they had memories of the country being together and what everybody did to help the effort. Mm-hmm. Was your mother one of the women who went to work?
My mom had divorced and left, so. Oh,
okay.
So I saw her quite regularly, but didn't live with her again until that 1 year in the Canal Zone. And then I came back to Stafford and had my high school year back in my regular high school with my friends. And then I went on to college from there. And I went back to Ohio. I went to Oberlin, Ohio, which is south of Cleveland, mm-hmm. and got my bachelor degree there.
What was the year like living in the Panama Canal Zone?
It was just, everything was different. The way we dressed, the way we went to school, everything was different. I think one of the most interesting things about it for me was that we had a lot of different nationalities at the school. I wasn't really used to that very mm-hmm. much. In Stafford, there were a lot of Italian kids, so I was very involved in the whole Italian thing. But then in the Canal Zone, there were it was a public school for American children, mm-hmm. but other kids, their families paid to go there. And we had quite a few diplomatic children there from different countries, but also Panamanians. The really, really wealthy Panamanians sent their children to the United States to prep school, but the next level down sent their kids to this school where I went, Balboa High School. There were 2 American high schools in the Canal Zone, one on the Pacific side, one on the Atlantic side. I was on the Pacific side. And interestingly enough, when I got here, and somehow or the other Nancy Lowe and I started getting to know each other, she was a Zonian, they were called. Her family had gone to the Canal Zone building the canal, and they were generations there, and she was born there, and we were actually in high school together, but we never knew it. She was 2 years younger.
Oh my goodness.
We never crossed paths. And to figure it out here was so surprising.
That's one of the things that's been a delight about doing these interviews is we find out how people's paths have crossed and they never know until they get here, perhaps.
Right.
And somebody watching us today may have been a Zonian too. You know, you might find somebody else.
There's another Zonian. Hi.
How do you think that experience impacted you later in life?
It did make a big difference to me because there was racial tension between the Panamanian kids and the other children. And I knew nothing. I mean, I was totally out of it. And I walked into that school not having any idea of how anything worked or who, I didn't know anybody. And the first class that I went to was a chemistry class, and we had to choose a partner to do experiments with. And I just turned to the girl next to me and said, "Would you be my partner?" And it was a Panamanian girl. And I never thought anything about that. But when I got out of the class, a couple of people came up to me and spoke to me and said, "You'll have to change your partner." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, we don't do that. We don't mix with the Panamanians that way." And I said, "I'm proud of myself." My dad was a guy who was very fair. He wanted everybody to be treated the same way. And I said, "No, I'm not going to change." And it makes me a little teary because I actually had, for some years after that, we used to write to each other.
I think it's probably helped shape the person you are today.
I think it probably did in the long run.
Mm-hmm. So let's fast forward to going to college.
Went to Oberlin College. I desperately wanted to be an archaeologist. I read everything during high school about archaeology. So I went to Oberlin and was in totally the wrong school. Because to be an archaeologist, you had to be a sociology major, and unfortunately that department was not really the greatest. And I was taking social classes and really bored. But at the same time we had to take an art course, an English course, a history course, language. The art courses I was taking really were touching me, and I was really excited by that. So finally it hit me by my junior year. Took a little while to get through that it was time for me to change my major to art history, and I did that. And I'm forever glad I did, because at the end of the 4 years of school, I was asked if I'd like to stay and work. Oberlin had a very, very excellent art museum, and I was really honored to be asked to stay to work there for a year. And of course I was low man on the totem pole, and I did all the stuff. Like, they had a huge collection of American goblets, glasses. and I had to wash every single goblet. I only broke one.
Good for you.
But it was such a great introduction to museum work, and it was very good to have that on my resume that I'd done that. So Oberlin was a good place for me.
And from Oberlin, what happened next in your life?
Then I got married. My husband was studying at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, so I moved there. I worked at the Baltimore Museum of Art, and the most wonderful thing that ever happened, well, there were two wonderful things. The first was my first daughter, Lisa, was born there in Baltimore. And then my other daughter, Annie, was born 2 years later up in Rochester, New York. But Baltimore was really a wonderful place to live. And I feel sad now when I read about Baltimore because I don't remember it that way at all. I was very happy there. I had an aunt and uncle who lived nearby, saw them a lot. I had my baby. I still was able to work part-time at the Baltimore Museum, and it was a great way to start the next phase of my life.
From there, did you moved to Rochester?
We went to Rochester, and my second daughter, Annie, was born up there. And I worked in 3 different museums there. It's funny, I started out in art museums, but as time went by, there are a lot of different kinds of museums. So I worked in the Memorial Art Gallery, which was part of the University of Rochester. I also worked at George Eastman House, which is a well-known museum of photography. And then I worked at Genesee Country Museum, which is between Rochester and Buffalo. And it's an outdoor history museum where buildings have been brought in from all around that part of New York State. And we showed the whole history of the development of that area with the canal, Erie Canal coming through. And I just had a really wonderful career. I never made much money, but I really had fun.
And that's
I worked
important.
in all these different places, and I met so many interesting people. I think one of the things that was really important to me that changed my view of things was working at Genesee Country Museum. We had a lot of people who were dressed in costumes of the period, and they were mostly retired farm people, agriculture people. And I really learned to respect those people so much and to realize how hard it really is to be farming and to deal with the climate, changes in the weather, the market, how things changed, and just what they really had to think about, that it was not just that you go out and throw some seeds around and stuff grows, and you know, it was much more complicated. And I think I also at that time I began to really respect older people's experience and get interested in listening to them. And now that I'm an older person, I'm glad I learned that when I did. I also learned that it's good to have a sense of humor when you're older. And
yes.
To be able to laugh at yourself.
For our viewers, would you compare that in some way to, you've been to the Agorama in Tifton?
I have been, yeah.
And is that kind of a similar?
Similar, yes.
Because most of those homes and buildings were brought in to that site.
Yeah, it was the same kind of idea.
And I think there are various villages like that around the country, or museums they may be called, but I think that's wonderful for young people to go through, and well, any of us, to be able to know what it was like in different times. And
yeah, I really liked it at the Agorama that they included young people, and they actually had kids doing stuff. Of course, they had to be careful about what they did, but I think it really brings history alive it's a lot different than just reading about it.
And being able to put your hands on it and touch it and have that
Taste
picture.
it.
Yes, and taste it.
That's really important.
Where did you left Rochester at some point? When did you leave? How long were you in Rochester?
I left Rochester. My husband and I were divorced. I was on my own. All of a sudden, I just was really, really tired of the winters in Rochester. And driving up there, I was commuting pretty far, and it just wasn't fun. And so I decided to see what was available in Florida. There are, in those days, of course, online. It would be online now, but then there was the American Museum Association had a magazine with job listings, and there was a job listed for an education person at the Museum of Florida History in Tallahassee. And that's what I applied for. And I got it. And I got to Florida in the 80s. So I've been here for quite a while.
And I know that we've had tours from here and going to that museum in Tallahassee in the past. I think it's a wonderful collection.
It is. And very well displayed. We really had a strong design department. And there's actually a man coming here working with Millie and me and the archives who worked there when I was working there. We found each other here.
Oh, good.
And he's a designer, and we're doing a new exhibit for the archives together.
Well, we're going to talk some more about that in a few minutes. How long did you live in Tallahassee?
I don't know exactly. I'd have to go back and look at my records.
Did your daughters grow up?
I was there for quite a while. My kids, by that time, I had one child in college and one child almost in college. So they were basically grown up, and they didn't come and live here with me.
When I know you also lived in Jacksonville at one time.
Yeah, I married a man that I met in Tallahassee. He grew up in Fernandina, Amelia Island, a real cracker guy. And we did go up to New York State for a while, but we came back here. We moved to St. Augustine, and he worked in the Spanish Quarter Museum. He was in costume. He was their historic woodworker, and he was also a retired Navy guy, but a retired archaeologist. I guess when you're an archaeologist, you really never retire.
Right, probably not.
Anyway, so I did get my wish about archaeology from way back when I was in high school. I didn't participate in that with him, but I heard a lot about it. And
but you had a lot to share with him, too, that you
We did have a
knew.
lot to share. We both enjoyed history, and so we were in St. Augustine for quite a while. And then I worked up in Jacksonville. I really commuted from St. Augustine up to Jacksonville to the Museum of Science and History. And that was the first museum where I ever had to deal with animals.
Oh, yes, they did have a good collection.
Well, actually, that's not true. The first, at the Genesee Country Museum, we had some animals there. And one funny thing that happened was we had a cow. And the museum was just opened in this nice part of the year. It wasn't open in the winter. So the cow was farmed out to a farm in the wintertime, and they told us that she did not have any access to any bulls. But turned out she did, and we didn't know she was pregnant. And so all of a sudden, I got a call in my office on the walkie-talkies that we had to get down there to the log cabin as quick as I could. And I didn't know what was going on. We had 2 school groups and the cow was giving birth.
That was an educational experience for a lot of them, wasn't it?
Teachers and of course the kids were fascinated. The teachers and the parents who'd come with them were horrified. And we got phone calls later how horrible this was. But anyway, that was my first experience with animals. But then in Jacksonville at the Museum of Science, and I always have to go back to what the names of all these museums.
Museum
of Science and History. We had fish, alligators, and snakes.
I spent a lot of time there with my children, so I'm familiar with this. And one of my older son's first volunteer opportunities was there doing the planetarium show.
Yeah.
He did that in high school, yeah.
Yeah, that was interesting to have the planetarium there.
He's not kept that as a career goal.
It was hard to have school groups in there because it was a great place because it was dark. Mm-hmm. You could get in a lot of trouble. And since I was director of education, it was up to me to control what was going on in there.
You know, he never mentioned that. I never thought of it from that angle, but I understand what you're saying. I'll have to ask him about that.
When people think of museum work, it's like, oh, how nice. You're dealing with all these pretty things and nothing to worry about. But there were all kinds of things to worry about. But it also was very, I guess it felt as if I was really, the thing we talked about, that history and all kinds of things become very real when you really have it right in front of you, or you can touch it, or you can talk to somebody who really knows about it. It's much different than sitting in a classroom.
Mm-hmm. And I remember, at least at the time they were growing up, there was a really nice section about the history of Jacksonville with the fire, the 1901 fire, and other parts of, the history of the city.
Yeah, when I was working there, so I must have been there before he was, the people who had designed that museum had not put any windows on the riverside. So you couldn't see Jacksonville from the museum, which was really, really hard. And right when I was leaving, they were beginning to really concentrate on the history of Jacksonville, and they were going to open up windows, which I hope they did, onto the riverside so that you could see.
I think they did.
I think they did. Because when I was there, we had to depend on photographs of what was right outside the window. It was silly.
Tip, how did you and your husband learn about the village?
My husband found out about it by reading a little brochure or a little magazine that was at the grocery store. And he had a type of illness that was very hard to explain to people. He'd been chemically damaged, either when he was like a child growing up in Amelia Island with all the pulp mills around, or in the Navy. He worked with nuclear weapons and did other things. Anyway, he was super sensitive to any kind of air pollution, and we really needed to be in a place where everything was close by so that he could go around in a golf cart. Because if he was driving by himself, he might have one of these attacks. It was sort of like a heart attack, and he just would have to stop driving. But he could get around here and deal with this place just fine. And so that's why we came here. We really came over and visited, and first we were going to move into an apartment, but we had a feral cat, and she was just crazed if you put her inside. So we had to buy a house for our cat.
Oh, good. You were talking earlier about the archives, village archives. Would you tell your viewers a little bit about that and what you've done there through the
That's
years?
been really interesting. That's been really another fun part of my museum career, I guess you'd call it. We moved right in next to Millie Griswold. She was the first person who came to see us and brought brownies, of course. And when she found out about my museum background, she was working here then, and she was really interested in the whole historical thing. And she was also an Advent Christian from birth, so she knew a lot about the background here, which I knew nothing about. So she took me up over above the lodge and showed me that attic up there that was full of boxes of photographs. And so we decided we needed to do something about them. Pomeroy had saved all of this material, and it really needed to be cataloged. And we were able to contact people back over in Tallahassee. I had some connections over there, but it didn't really require me to do it, but it was just good that I knew people. Anyway, we got a grant for a computer and a computer program, and we used an office over in the Village Hall. And this was in early 2000s, probably 2001. We started cataloging photographs. And then the greatest thing for me was that every Tuesday morning when Pomeroy and I were both in town, he would sit with me and I would hand him photographs and he would identify them and I would write it down. Pretty soon I figured out I really should be recording him, so I did that. And I just learned so much, and he told me so many funny stories. We got really loud and noisy and we had to close the door because we were bothering everybody else who was trying to do stuff. But what a pleasure. What a wonderful experience for me. And when Millie and I started this whole thing, we said, we really don't know if anybody's going to care. But this does need to be cataloged. So we just kept chugging along. And now we have over 4,000 files and photographs. And many of those files have more than one. Like if it was one of the children who was here, we may have 5 or 6 pictures of that child all in one folder. So,
well, you and Millie have done a wonderful job of helping to preserve the community and its life and history. And thank you for that.
Well, it was really nice to end up with a room attached to the library and exhibit space where we could actually show. We don't have a lot of objects, but the biggest part of the collection is photographs, but also Millie has gone into books. She's done a lot with Florida books and Advent Christian books and a lot of documentation. It's just quite an amazing group of things over there, and we encourage people to come and visit.
Well, we certainly do, and we're going to have to end our conversation now, but they can come and talk to you or Millie at the archives and learn more about that.
That's right. Okay.
Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Front Porch Conversations.